It was a typical Sunday afternoon in Springfield, Massachusetts. The sun was beginning to set. Inside a modest two-story house on Maple Street, Sarah Johnson, a 35-year-old woman with brown hair tied in a ponytail, was sweating over the stove in the kitchen. The smell of garlic and fresh herbs filled the air, blending with the aroma of tomato sauce bubbling in a large pot. Sarah stirred the sauce with a wooden spoon, tasting it occasionally and adding a pinch of salt or a fresh basil leaf. Next to it, in another pot, the pasta was cooking slowly. Sarah glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall, an antique piece that had belonged to her grandmother. Only an hour remained until her mother-in-law, Linda, would arrive. She felt a knot in her stomach at the thought. Linda always criticized her cooking, no matter how hard she tried. "It's going to be fine this time," Sarah murmured to herself, trying to calm down. She wiped her hands on the floral apron she was wearing and went to the fridge. She pulled out the ingredients for the salad: curly lettuce, cherry tomatoes, cucumber, and red onion. Skillfully, she began washing and cutting the vegetables. In the next room, Sarah could hear her husband Mike and their son Tommy setting the table. The sound of dishes and silverware being arranged on the dining table reminded her that time was passing quickly. "Mom, can I help?" Tommy's voice sounded from the kitchen doorway. Sarah smiled at her 6-year-old son, with his tousled blonde hair and curious blue eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. How about helping me make the garlic bread?" Sarah grabbed a baguette and began slicing it while Tommy mixed minced garlic with butter in a small bowl. As they worked together, Sarah's nervousness began to ease a bit. No matter what Linda thought, she knew her family appreciated her efforts. With a determined sigh, she turned her attention back to the sauce. Tonight, she would do her best, as she always did. At exactly 7 p.m., the doorbell rang, echoing through the Johnson home. Sarah felt her heart race. She quickly straightened her apron and ran her hands through her hair, trying to look more presentable. Mike, dressed in a blue polo shirt and khakis, went to the front door, took a deep breath, and opened it. Linda Thompson stood at the doorstep, a 60-year-old woman with perfectly arranged gray hair and a rigid posture. She wore a beige skirt and blazer set, as if she were attending a formal event rather than a family dinner. Her blue eyes, identical to Mike's, critically examined the entrance to the house. "Hi, Mom," Mike said, forcing a smile and giving her a quick hug. Linda returned the hug without much enthusiasm, her thin lips curving into a forced smile. "Good evening, Michael," she replied, stepping inside. Her low heels made a soft sound on the wooden floor as she removed her light coat. Mike took it and hung it on the coat rack near the door. Linda looked around the living room, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a pillow out of place on the couch and a few magazines scattered on the coffee table. Before she could say anything, an excited shout echoed through the house. "Grandma!" Tommy came running down the hallway, his bare feet thumping on the floor. He threw himself into Linda's arms, who was momentarily taken by surprise. Her face softened slightly as she hugged her grandson. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice a bit warmer. "You're growing so fast." At that moment, Sarah appeared from the kitchen, still wearing her floral apron. She smiled nervously, wringing a dish towel in her hands. "Good evening, Linda," Sarah greeted her, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I hope you're hungry. Dinner's almost ready." Linda looked Sarah up and down, her eyes lingering on the stained apron and the slightly messy hair. She just nodded in response, her face showing no emotion. "Shall we head to the dining room?" Mike suggested, trying to ease the palpable tension in the air. He led his mother down the hallway, with Tommy skipping ahead of them. Sarah followed, taking a deep breath and mentally preparing herself for what was to come. The Johnson family and Linda settled around the oak dining table, a family heirloom from Mike's side. A white lace tablecloth, a wedding gift to Sarah, covered its polished surface. In the center, a simple arrangement of wildflowers in a glass vase tried to add a touch of cheer to the tense atmosphere. With slightly trembling hands, Sarah began serving dinner. The steam from the freshly served pasta rose into the air, carrying the tempting aroma of fresh herbs and tomatoes. The colorful salad sat in a glass bowl on the side, and the golden garlic bread rested in a basket lined with a cloth napkin. "I hope you like it," Sarah said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness as she placed the last plate in front of Linda. Linda looked at the plate with an expression that mixed skepticism and displeasure. She picked up the fork delicately, as if she were about to touch something unpleasant, and stabbed a single noodle. Everyone at the table seemed to hold their breath as Linda brought the fork to her mouth. As soon as the pasta touched her tongue, Linda's face twisted into a grimace she didn't even try to hide. Her lips pressed tightly together, and she swallowed with visible effort, as if making a great sacrifice. "Sarah, dear," Linda said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that barely masked the venom behind her words. She carefully placed the fork next to her plate, as if she didn't want to touch the food any longer. "Your cooking is truly awful. I don't know what my dear son saw in you. It certainly wasn't your culinary talent." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Her face burned with shame and anger, and she could feel tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. She lowered her gaze to her own plate, unable to look at anyone at the table. Mike seemed to be in shock, his fork suspended midair halfway to his mouth. Tommy, with his big, innocent eyes, looked from his grandmother to his mother, clearly confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in the room, marking each second of the uncomfortable silence that had fallen. The smell of the food, which moments before had been so inviting, now hung in the air like a bitter reminder of Linda's cruel comment. The silence that followed Linda's biting remark seemed to weigh a ton over the Johnson family's dining table. Sarah, still standing by the table, felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her hands, which held the pasta dish, trembled slightly. She could feel the heat rising up her neck, coloring her cheeks a deep red. Slowly, Sarah raised her eyes, meeting Mike's gaze across the table. His brown eyes, usually full of love and warmth, now reflected a mix of emotions, shame, anger, and a silent plea for forgiveness. Mike opened his mouth as if to say something in defense of his wife, but Sarah shook her head almost imperceptibly. In that moment, a silent conversation passed between the couple. Sarah, with tear-filled eyes, begged Mike not to make things worse. She didn't want a fight, not in front of Tommy. Mike, for his part, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. His jaw was tense, and a vein pulsed in his temple. It was clear he wanted to stand up for Sarah, to confront his mother, but his wife's silent plea held him back. Mike closed his mouth and looked away, turning his attention back to the plate in front of him. He picked up his fork and began to poke at the food without really eating, frustration evident in every movement. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She carefully placed the pasta dish back on the table, her hands still trembling slightly. With superhuman effort, she managed to sit in her chair without shedding the tears that threatened to fall. The only sound in the room was the clinking of silverware against plates. Linda, seemingly satisfied with the discomfort she had caused, ate small portions of salad with an expression of superiority. Tommy, sensing the tension in the air, ate silently, his big eyes moving from one adult to another, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah picked up her own fork, forcing herself to eat despite the knot in her throat. Every bite felt like an ordeal, the food she had so carefully prepared now bitter in her mouth. She knew that responding in kind would only make things worse, but the silence was almost unbearable. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each tick-tock seeming to echo in the quiet room. Sarah and Mike continued to exchange quick glances, a silent conversation happening between them. Both knew something needed to be said, but neither could find the right words to break the suffocating silence. Tommy Johnson, just 6 years old, sat between his parents, his little feet swinging without touching the floor. His big blue eyes, wide and curious, moved from one adult to the next, trying to decipher the strange behavior he was seeing around him. The boy, with his messy blonde hair and freckles on his nose, was confused by the sudden change in the atmosphere of the dining room. Just moments earlier, Tommy had been excited about the family dinner. He loved it when Grandma Linda came to visit, even though she sometimes seemed a little too serious, as he often said. But now, something was different. The smile he had worn when he saw his grandma arrive had faded, replaced by a look of concern. Tommy had clearly heard what Grandma said about Mom's cooking. The words, awful, and, I don't know what my dear son saw in you, echoed in his young mind. He didn't fully understand the meaning behind those words, but he knew they were bad. The tone of Linda's voice, which he rarely heard directed at him, made him shrink a little in his chair. The boy looked down at his plate, full of the pasta his mom had prepared with so much care. He loved Sarah's cooking. To Tommy, no one in the world cooked better than his mom. He couldn't understand why Grandma was being so mean. Raising his eyes, Tommy saw his mom's face. Sarah looked sad, almost as if she was about to cry. This made the boy's heart ache. He wanted to say something, anything, to make his mom smile again, but the words got stuck in his throat. Then Tommy looked at his dad. Mike seemed angry, but in a way Tommy had never seen before. His dad was usually calm and smiling, but now his expression was serious, almost scary. Suddenly, a memory popped into Tommy's mind. He remembered a conversation he had overheard a few weeks ago. His dad had been talking to Mom in the kitchen, thinking Tommy was watching TV in the living room. Mike had said something about Grandma Linda's cooking, something Tommy hadn't fully understood at the time but now seemed important. The boy felt a growing urge to say something, to stand up for his mom. He knew he wasn't supposed to interrupt adult conversations, but this felt different. Tommy bit his lip, unsure. His eyes scanned the table, observing the uncomfortable silence that had settled. Then Tommy decided he couldn't stay quiet. He took a deep breath, gathering all the courage his small 6-year-old body could muster. With his heart pounding, he prepared to speak, not knowing the impact his innocent words would have on the dinner. The heavy silence around the dining table was suddenly broken by Tommy's innocent voice. "Grandma," he said, his voice a little shaky but determined. All eyes turned to the 6-year-old, who had suddenly become the center of attention. Tommy swallowed nervously, feeling the weight of the adults' gazes on him. But something inside him, maybe an innate sense of justice or simply the love for his mom, pushed him to continue. "Dad always says your cooking is what's really bad." The words tumbled out of his mouth like a whirlwind, and the effect was immediate. Sarah, who had been looking down, lifted her head abruptly, her eyes wide in surprise. Mike, sitting next to her, went rigid in his chair, his face rapidly shifting from pale to deep red. But Tommy wasn't finished. With the innocent honesty of a child, he continued, "He said he never told you because he didn't want to hurt your feelings, but Mom's cooking is way better." The boy looked around the table, unaware of the full impact of his words. He saw his mom's face, which now showed a mix of shock and a faint smile of satisfaction. His dad, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. Sinking into his chair and avoiding everyone's gaze, Linda, the grandmother, was completely still. Her face, normally composed and critical, now showed an expression of complete shock. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer filled with tension and discomfort but rather with a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and, in Sarah's case, a quiet sense of vindication. Tommy, still not fully understanding what he had done, looked back down at his plate and continued, "I love Mom's cooking. Her pasta is the best in the world." He picked up his fork and started eating enthusiastically, as if to prove his point. The contrast between Tommy's innocence and the tension between the adults was palpable. Sarah struggled to suppress a smile. Alternating glances between her son and her husband, Mike seemed to be fighting an internal battle, torn between embarrassment and relief that the truth had finally come out. Linda, for her part, looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her certainties and her critical posture had been shaken by the simple, honest words of her grandson. The silence persisted, broken only by the sound of Tommy's fork scraping his plate. While the adults at the table tried to process what had just happened, Linda Thompson felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The words of her 6-year-old grandson echoed in her ears, each syllable like a blow to her armor of superiority. She was paralyzed in her chair, her wide eyes fixed on Tommy, who continued eating his pasta, unaware of the chaos he had unleashed. Linda's face, usually a mask of composure and criticism, was now a mosaic of emotions. Her cheeks, once pale, turned a pinkish hue of shame. Her lips, usually ready to deliver sharp remarks, trembled slightly. She tried to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. With trembling hands, Linda placed her utensils on the table. The soft clink of metal against porcelain seemed deafening in the silence that followed. She looked at Mike, her son, desperately seeking a denial, an explanation, anything that could contradict Tommy's words. But Mike only looked away, his face a mixture of embarrassment and relief. That silent gesture was more eloquent than any words could have been. It was a mute confirmation of Tommy's words, and for Linda, it was like a second blow. Years of criticism, of belittling comments about Sarah's cooking, of unsolicited comparisons to her own culinary skills, all of it now came back to haunt her. Linda felt a wave of nausea rising in her throat, not because of the food on her plate, but because of the sudden realization of her own hypocrisy. She looked at the plate in front of her, the pasta she had just declared awful. Now, in the light of Tommy's revelations, the dish seemed to mock her. The aroma she had turned her nose up at earlier now smelled delicious, making her stomach rumble traitorously. Linda felt everyone's eyes on her. Sarah, with a mix of shock and a barely perceptible air of triumph. Mike, still avoiding eye contact but visibly tense. And Tommy, innocent Tommy, who continued eating happily, occasionally glancing at her with his big blue eyes, not fully understanding the impact of his words. The silence in the room was deafening. Linda could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second feeling like an eternity. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. Her hands, normally steady and confident, now visibly trembled. In that moment, Linda Thompson, the critical, seemingly unshakable mother-in-law, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: shame. A deep, overwhelming shame that made her question every criticism, every hurtful comment she had ever made. And, for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what to say or do next. Sarah Johnson felt a wave of conflicting emotions sweep over her. On one hand, there was undeniable relief and even a small sense of satisfaction in seeing her mother-in-law, Linda, finally confronted with the truth. Years of constant criticism and belittling comments about her cooking had left deep emotional scars on Sarah, and now, thanks to her son's innocent words, the truth was out in the open. Her eyes slowly moved from Tommy to Linda, watching the transformation on her mother-in-law's face. Linda's mask of superiority had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability Sarah had never seen before. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a spark of empathy. After all, being exposed like that, especially by a grandchild, wasn't an easy experience for anyone. However, that empathy quickly gave way to a growing concern. Sarah glanced at her husband, Mike, who seemed to be wrestling with his own internal conflict. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided everyone's gaze. Sarah knew that Mike had always tried to keep the peace between her and his mother, often at the expense of his own feelings. Now, with his secret out, she feared the repercussions this might have on their marriage. Her eyes returned to Tommy, who continued eating his pasta, unaware of the drama he had caused. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride in her son's honesty and courage, but apprehension about the possible consequences his words might have on the family dynamic. The silence in the room was oppressive, and Sarah felt the need to do something, to say something, to break the tension. But the words eluded her. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, uncertain of how to proceed. Meanwhile, her mind raced, trying to anticipate the ramifications of this revelation. How would this affect future family dinners? Tommy's relationship with his grandmother? Her own relationship with Linda? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She knew that this moment was a turning point, a catalyst for long-needed changes in the family dynamic. But she also knew that navigating those changes would be a delicate challenge. With a mix of determination and uncertainty, Sarah prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that her next words and actions could shape the future of her family. Mike Johnson felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as his son Tommy's words echoed around the dining room. The secret he had kept for years, his true opinions about his mother's cooking compared to his wife's, had been revealed in the most unexpected and innocent way possible. His face, usually calm and composed, was now a canvas of conflicting emotions. Shame, relief, guilt, and a touch of panic swirled within him, making it difficult for him to maintain his usual composure. Mike swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of everyone at the table on him, especially those of his mother and his wife. For a moment, Mike considered denying everything, coming up with an excuse, or pretending that Tommy had misunderstood some conversation. But when he looked at his son's innocent face, happily eating his pasta, Mike realized he couldn't keep up the lie. It was time to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Slowly, Mike raised his eyes, first meeting Sarah's gaze. There was a mix of surprise and understanding in her eyes, and that gave Mike the courage he needed. Then, with a deep sigh, he turned to his mother. "Mom," Mike began, his voice trembling but gaining strength as he spoke, "Tommy's right. I should have said something a long time ago. Sarah's cooking is wonderful, and I really do prefer her food." The silence that followed was deafening. Mike could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. He saw the shock and hurt in his mother's eyes, but also a flicker of understanding. "I'm sorry for not being honest before," Mike continued, feeling that now he had started, he couldn't stop. "I didn't want to hurt your feelings, but I realized that by doing that, I was hurting Sarah and being unfair to all of us." Mike looked around the table at each member of his family. At Tommy, who was now watching him with curiosity. At Sarah, whose eyes shone with a mix of pride and concern. And finally, at his mother, Linda, who seemed to be processing everything in silence. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about this," Mike concluded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "We all deserve that." With those words, Mike felt as if a door had been opened. A door to more open and honest communication within his family. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful that they could build stronger, more authentic relationships from this moment of simple, yet significant, truth. The silence that followed Mike's words was broken by the soft sound of Linda crying. Tears streamed down the matriarch's face, years of pride and stubbornness dissolving before everyone's eyes. Sarah, moved by an unexpected compassion, stood up and hugged her mother-in-law, a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself. I'm sorry," Linda sobbed, her voice choked with emotion. "I just wanted to feel important, to feel needed. I didn't realize how much harm I was causing." Tommy, confused by the emotional scene, approached timidly. "Grandma, you still make the best cookies in the world," he said, offering an innocent smile that melted everyone's hearts. Mike, encouraged by the honesty now filling the room, added, "Mom, we love you. Your importance to this family doesn't depend on your cooking. It's time we build a relationship based on love and mutual acceptance." In the days and weeks that followed, the Johnson family underwent a profound transformation. Linda, motivated by a desire to genuinely reconnect with her family, enrolled in cooking classes with Sarah. The two women, once rivals, became partners in the kitchen, exchanging recipes and laughter. Mike, freed from the burden of his secret, became more open and communicative, not just with his family but also in his work and friendships. He and Sarah renewed their vows, this time with Linda helping to plan the party, including a buffet prepared jointly by mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Tommy, though too young to fully grasp the impact of his words, thrived in the more harmonious family environment. His innocent honesty became a constant reminder to the adults of the value of truth and authenticity. The most surprising change, however, was in Linda. She learned to find value in herself beyond her cooking skills. She began volunteering at a local community center, discovering a new passion for helping others. Family dinners, once a silent battlefield, became a moment everyone looked forward to. Laughter and lively conversation replaced the tense silence, and the table was always filled with dishes made with love. Some from Sarah, some from Linda, and occasionally even experimental creations from Mike and Tommy. This story reminds us that honesty, though sometimes painful at first, can be the catalyst for deep growth and stronger relationships. It teaches us that it's never too late to change, to apologize, and to rebuild family bonds. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content like this. Leave a like on the video if you believe in the power of honesty and family love. And in the comments, share with us, have you ever experienced a situation where the truth, even though difficult, positively transformed your life? Your experience could inspire others to have the courage to be honest and open in their relationships. Remember, every small act of sincerity can be the beginning of a great transformation. See you in the next video.